Hello, folks. Tonight, we're diving headfirst into the grime-caked rabbit hole that is hygiene in the 1200s. And no, we're not talking about some romanticized, soft-focused version with scented candles and warm towels. Forget that. This is medieval hygiene, where cleanliness was more of a sliding scale, and bathing was often a group activity, shared not only with strangers and barn animals, but also with whatever illnesses happened to be drifting through the air that season. So before you settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is over there. I always get a kick out of seeing who else is lying in bed at this hour, wondering if people actually wash their hair with fermented urine. Now, go ahead and dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's ease into tonight's descent together. When historians talk about medieval Europe, they usually spotlight the kings, the battles, and the grandeur of cathedrals. What they mention far less often is the ever-present, inescapable smell. It drifted through every town and village, a dense, stubborn cocktail of body odor, smoke, stagnant puddles, and the occasional dead animal discreetly hidden behind someone's shed. People didn't just smell bad, they smelled inventive. And no, it wasn't because they didn't care. Hygiene actually mattered. It just played by a different set of rules. Many peasants truly believed that washing too frequently could make you ill. The thinking went like this. Bathing opened the pores, which in turn allowed sickness to crawl in and make itself at home, like an unwanted guest that refused to leave. Cleanliness wasn't about sterility. It was about protection from demons said to travel on hot steam. When people did bathe, it was no casual affair. In towns, they used public bathhouses, large wooden buildings where hot water was poured into communal tubs, reused again and again, often without any proper cleaning between bathers. Think of it like medieval group therapy, except with fewer emotional breakthroughs and significantly more floating body hair. Some bathhouses had decent reputations, others not so much. The line between a steamy soak and a second business run on whispers and side glances was razor thin. Historians still debate whether bathhouses were ever truly about hygiene, or if they served as hotbeds for gossip, matchmaking, and perhaps a few less discussed extracurriculars. For those in the countryside or peasants without access to such public luxuries, the setup was much more basic: a wooden tub, a bucket, and a whole lot of wishful thinking. Water had to be hauled in from a well or a stream, heated over an open fire, and then lugged back inside, ideally without spilling it all along the way. The tub itself was used over and over, often by the entire family in one session. Father went first, then the mother, and then the children, in strict descending order of seniority and increasing grime. By the time the baby got a turn, the water had taken on the look and smell of thin gravy with maybe a hint of turnip. Technically, soap existed. It was made from animal fat and ashes, boiled into a chunky paste that did a fine job of removing both dirt and several layers of skin. For those who couldn't afford soap or worried it might ruin their complexion, there were alternatives: sand, vinegar, or just the vigorous application of prayers. Washing hair was its own kind of problem. Combs were made from wood or bone, and lice were so common they were practically a household feature. Remedies included rubbing the scalp with vinegar-soaked rosemary or sleeping with garlic braided into your hair, like a pungent, medieval dream catcher. These methods may have irritated the lice, but getting rid of them entirely? That was a stretch. Historians still debate whether these treatments helped or simply made people smell like a walking salad. As for dental care, or something loosely resembling it, it did exist. People used chewing sticks made from aromatic woods to freshen their breath. In some homes, tooth powders were made from crushed eggshells, charcoal, and salt. The goal back then wasn't to prevent cavities, because, frankly, the very concept of cavities hadn't yet arrived. What people cared about was not driving others away with their breath. In more desperate cases, folks would rub their gums with mint or even onion juice, which might explain why medieval courtship was typically conducted from a cautious and courteous distance. Laundry, meanwhile, was just as much of an adventure. Most garments were made of wool or coarse linen, and peasants often wore the same outfit for several days, sometimes even weeks. Undergarments, when available, helped soak up the sweat and grime, But it was the outer layers that truly bore the brunt of daily life. Washing clothes meant hauling them down to the nearest river, scrubbing them with soap or ash on flat stones, and beating the fabric until it either looked passably clean or simply surrendered. This wasn't a daily affair, far from it. Doing laundry required enormous effort and consumed hours of precious time. Most people did it only a few times per season, usually once the clothing smell developed a personality of its own. Afterward, garments were draped over bushes or hedges to dry, which also had the helpful side effect of airing them out for the entire village to enjoy. And yet, despite the filth, the smell, and the general chaos, medieval people genuinely did try to smell better. Many carried small pouches filled with fragrant herbs, or rubbed lavender on their wrists as a kind of makeshift perfume. The wealthier classes took it a step further. They might own perfumed gloves or tiny balls of ambergris, a waxy, bizarrely prized substance harvested from the intestines of whales, which for some reason became a fashionable scent. If you had the coin, you could cover your natural musk with something just as strange but socially acceptable. If you didn't, you simply crossed your fingers and hoped everyone around you smelled even worse. Odor was such a common fact of life that entire cities began developing reputations for their distinct atmospheres. London, for instance, wasn't just known for its size. It was infamous for its peculiar blend of fish markets, tanning pits, and open communal waste ditches, giving it what one monk generously described as a memorable fragrance. Homes only made matters worse. Most didn't have chimneys, so smoke from open cooking fires clung to every surface: walls, clothes, even skin. Combine that with minimal ventilation, damp straw mattresses, and livestock casually wandering through the front door, and you ended up with a household scent best described as agricultural, tinged with notes of despair. Still, people found ways to cope. Some lined their homes with bundles of dried herbs. Others burned resin or incense when guests came over. In wealthier households, servants scattered the floors with rushes mixed with fragrant flower petals. These slowly turned brown and crispy underfoot, soaking up moisture while masking less pleasant truths. There were also deeply rooted rituals tied to cleanliness in religious spaces. Monks, for example, routinely washed their hands before meals and performed symbolic foot washings. Pilgrims, too, were sometimes expected to cleanse themselves in rivers before entering sacred locations. But again, this wasn't hygiene in the modern sense. It was spiritual purification. Dirt on the body was tolerable. Dirt on the soul? Not so much. Bathing customs varied significantly depending on the region. In parts of Italy and the Middle East, regular bathing was fairly common, even encouraged. In colder regions, however, bathhouses gradually fell out of favor, especially during outbreaks of plague. People feared that hot water might open the body to disease. Better to stay dry, dusty, and alive than to risk inviting death in on a cloud of steam. By modern standards, medieval hygiene may look like a total disaster. But for its time, it was an intricate patchwork of habits, beliefs, and adaptations, built around limited access to water, poor infrastructure, and a fundamentally different understanding of how illness worked. And perhaps that's the key takeaway. People didn't stop trying to be clean, they just defined clean in a different way. They adapted. They endured. They found dignity where they could. In a sprig of rosemary tucked behind the ear, in a bucket of lukewarm water, in the small and sacred act of trying. Because bathing in the 1200s wasn't just a routine, it was a performance. Equal parts ambition, discomfort, and minor peril. In a world where hot water was a rare luxury and privacy was little more than a rumor, the simple effort to get clean became something closer to a communal event, or, in certain locations, a low-grade scandal. Let's start with what passed for a private bath. Wealthier individuals might own a large wooden tub, usually barrel-shaped and occasionally equipped with handles for transport. It would be placed near the hearth indoors, or, for the bold, in the garden on a sunny day. Hot water was lugged in by the bucket, usually by a servant or two, a task that required muscle, firewood, and an alarming number of trips. The water rarely stayed hot for long. By the time the tub was full, it had cooled to a lukewarm muddle and often picked up floating debris from the bucket or soot from the kettle. Some attempted to pour the water through a linen cloth to strain out impurities, a noble effort that almost never worked. Most didn't bother. After all, a few flecks of grit were a small price to pay for the brief, glorious relief of not smelling like feet and sheep. If soap was involved, it typically came in the form of homemade lime-based mixtures or dense cakes made from rendered animal fat. The scent landed somewhere between overcooked bacon and scorched wood, with a texture to match, vague, questionable, and deeply committed to ambiguity. In towns, the bathhouse was the standard. These weren't glamorous Roman spas. They were humble wooden structures that resembled barns or oversized sheds, thick with steam and filled with the unmistakable scent of boiled bodies and simmering herbs. People entered in scheduled shifts and soaked in communal tubs or standalone barrels, experiencing either peaceful bliss or mild horror, depending entirely on who had bathed before them. For an added fee, you could request fragrant herbs like lavender, mint, or sage to be tossed into the water, scented efforts to wrestle body odor into submission. Bathhouses also employed attendants who offered scrubbing services, ranging from gentle massages to what felt more like attempts to sandblast your sins away. Some bathhouses featured multiple rooms with different temperatures, a hot steam chamber, a warm soaking pool, and a cold rinse area that was usually more of a gasping station than a comfortable finale. In theory, these spaces were meant for physical cleansing. In practice, they doubled as social hubs, gossip mills, and, on occasion, venues for activities best left unspoken in polite company. Historians still debate whether bathhouses were sincere hygiene centers or just steamy backdrops for whispered conversations and negotiated side gigs. The church, naturally, had mixed feelings about it all. Cleanliness might be next to godliness, but excessive nudity and visible pleasure in a bathhouse triggered suspicions of sin. Some regions outlawed mixed-gender bathing entirely. Others simply looked the other way. A few bathhouses posted moral warnings by the door. Others offered towels and subtle winks. Enforcement mostly depended on the mood of the nearest bishop. Bathing habits were seasonal, too. In summer, people bathed more often, if only because the heat and sweat made skipping obvious and socially risky. In winter, bathers were far fewer. Heating water was harder, and many genuinely feared that a warm bath in a cold, drafty house could lead to illness. Better to stay grimy and protected than to die of hygiene. Peasants, as always, had their own version. Their tubs were smaller, the water colder, and the concept of privacy practically non-existent. Entire families bathed together or in quick rotation using the same water. The order was fixed, eldest first, youngest last. Soap, if present at all, was minimal. Herbal rinses were more common, water boiled with thyme, rosemary, or nettles. Sometimes even beer made an appearance in the mix. Not because it worked better, but because it made for a good story afterward. The herbs added a bit of fragrance, and the beer, well, that added bragging rights. Some folks didn't even bother with tubs or heated water. Instead, they improvised entirely, opting for a quick plunge in a river or stream. That was considered the poor man's bath. In winter, the bravest among them might even break through ice to make it happen. Others just waited for rain and stood under the runoff from their roofs like damp, vaguely embarrassed scarecrows. It wasn't ideal, but it got the job done, at least until someone had to explain to their neighbor why they were once again naked in the yard. Children were bathed more frequently, not necessarily out of a heightened concern for hygiene, but because they were far more likely to soil themselves, fall headfirst into a mud puddle, or develop mysterious rashes. Babies were bathed with particular care, usually in small wooden basins or buckets. The water was gently warmed, and herbs were added, not only for cleanliness but also for superstition. Some mothers swore by washing their infants in milk. Others preferred ale. A few used concoctions that defy polite conversation altogether. Bathing customs weren't the same everywhere. In parts of Scandinavia, for instance, sauna-like steam baths remained a tradition throughout the Middle Ages. Rooted in much older rituals, these baths were typically gender-separated and combined physical cleansing with much-needed socializing, not to mention the added benefit of not freezing to death during the long winters. In contrast, some regions were far less enthusiastic. Entire communities believed that frequent washing actually weakened the body. Dirt, they claimed, acted as a shield, guarding against disease and even fending off malevolent spirits. And in a strange way, they weren't entirely wrong. While filth may not have repelled actual demons, it certainly helped keep nosy neighbors at bay. Medieval medical texts were no less conflicted. Some physicians encouraged warm baths to help balance the humors. Others sternly warned that hot water opened the pores and allowed dangerous vapors to invade. A bath might be prescribed to soothe melancholy, or banned entirely in cases of hysteria. Pregnant women were advised to steer clear of hot water, and the elderly were told to rinse only in tepid infusions. The underlying message was fairly consistent. Bathe if you must, but do not enjoy it too much, and whatever you do, don't get creative. Of course, there were exceptions. Nobles occasionally bathed with flair. Picture perfumed oils, rose petals floating on the surface, soft music echoing in the background, even poetry readings. These weren't so much baths as sensory performances. Courtiers sometimes bathed before major events or public appearances. Chroniclers wrote of elaborate pre-wedding purification baths, complete with scented sponges and attendants standing by with gleaming silver bowls. These rituals were as much declarations of wealth and refinement as they were exercises in hygiene. Yet even among the upper crust, bathing was done sparingly. Once a week, that was considered extravagant. Once a month, respectable. Once a season, perfectly fine, so long as you used enough perfume. The truly wealthy might have private bathhouses built into their estates, but even these were more decorative than practical, used mostly to impress guests rather than for daily scrubbing. Perhaps the clearest window into medieval bathing habits lies in the language of the time. A phrase like washing the head often meant nothing more than rinsing the scalp, not full-body immersion. To wash up might refer only to the hands and face. Full baths were rare, expensive, and, strangely, socially suspicious. If someone showed up looking too clean, people noticed. And not always in a good way. And honestly, there was logic to that caution. Heating enough water for a proper bath, pouring it into a tub, keeping it warm, and then drying off afterward. All of it required resources, time, and usually some degree of assistance. Then came the aftermath, soaked floors, wet linens, and the awkward ordeal of drying off in a house so drafty the windows were made of animal hide and modesty was at the mercy of the breeze. So bathing remained what it always had been. A gesture, a ritual, a sometimes successful attempt to reclaim one's body from the smoke and filth of daily life. It wasn't really about achieving cleanliness. It was about trying. And in a world of muddy roads, smoky hearths, and communal water, that effort counted for something. Public bathhouses in the 1200s weren't just places to scrub away layers of dirt. They were social crossroads, halfway between community hygiene centers and neighborhood gathering spots. These were places where you could find yourself sitting unclothed in a tub beside a merchant, a gossiping widow, a tax collector, or a barber, and somehow leave with cleaner skin and dirtier secrets. Bathhouses were rarely glamorous. They were typically humble, wooden structures with low ceilings and dense steam that never quite found a way to escape, no matter how many windows were propped open with sticks. The walls stayed damp. The floorboards groaned ominously, and the air inside held a heady blend of rosemary, boiled sweat, and civic optimism. Functionally, most bathhouses were divided into zones. The main soaking room featured large communal tubs, or, in wealthier towns, sunken pools carved into the floor and lined with stone. In smaller villages, the tubs were just oversized barrels. There were steam rooms too, known in some places as sweat chambers, where patrons wrapped themselves in towels, breathed in herbal vapors, and pretended they weren't slowly roasting like root vegetables. Operating hours were scribbled on wooden planks in rough charcoal and posted outside. Men and women typically bathed separately, though this wasn't a hard rule. Some towns allowed mixed bathing, especially during festivals. This led to a curious combination of hygiene, flirtation, and what church officials delicately called opportunities for unguarded conversation. Some establishments went even further, hosting evening sessions lit by flickering torchlight, attended by those seeking warm water and perhaps even warmer company. Upon arrival, guests paid a modest fee, sometimes a coin, other times a barter. A few eggs, a hunk of cheese, or a scrap of leather was enough for a basic soak. For this price, bathers gained access to hot water, a towel, hopefully cleanish, and occasionally a brush or strigil to scrape off lingering grime. Some bathhouses provided coarse linen robes. Others simply expected guests to bring their own, though not everyone complied. Disrobing took place in a communal changing space, which meant acknowledging the unspoken truth. Everyone was looking, and everyone was pretending not to. Clothes were hung on pegs, sometimes arranged by social rank. A noble's garments were not placed beside a baker's apron, unless, of course, someone was looking to spark a scandal or start a rumor. As for the water itself, freshness was never its most celebrated trait. Bathhouses typically reused the same water for multiple visitors, topping it up with hot water throughout the day and hoping for the best. Throughout the day, the surface of the bathwater was occasionally skimmed with a bucket or a reed strainer. Some patrons believed this added character to the experience. Others were convinced it gave them rashes. Realistically, both were probably right. Herbs were added not just for their pleasant aroma, but for their supposed medicinal value. Marjoram for aching joints, thyme to improve circulation, sage to sharpen the mind. A skilled bathhouse keeper understood how to balance the herb mix, depending on who was soaking. More lavender might be added when older women came by. More nettle or mustard seed was tossed in when groups of young bachelors arrived, complaining, rather theatrically, about aches from the fields. Bathhouse staff included water haulers, wood stokers, and attendants who offered scrubbing services. Some establishments even employed barbers to shave heads and faces with blades so dull they practically qualified as exfoliators. In more affluent towns, musicians, armed with lutes, flutes, and drums, played nearby, distracting guests from the questionable hygiene and the rising temperature of their surroundings. And in the wealthiest cities, bathhouses sometimes hosted storytellers who sat outside steam rooms spinning tales of love, betrayal, or the infamous time someone slipped on a patch of soap and accidentally caused a three-person pileup. For an extra fee, guests could also indulge in massages, scented oils, or even receive beauty tips from older attendants, many of whom claimed they once worked for nobility. The advice varied, but classics included, don't squint into the sun, avoid onions before social events, and most importantly, never trust a man who bathes too often. Yet bathhouses were more than just a luxury or indulgence. They also played a part in healthcare. Physicians occasionally prescribed regular bathing to treat ailments like melancholy, fatigue, or spleen congestion, a diagnosis that only medieval imagination could truly define. Hot baths were believed to draw out bad humors and restore internal balance. Cold baths, on the other hand, were said to shock the soul back into its proper alignment. There were social rules too, though rarely spoken aloud. One did not comment on another person's skin conditions. One did not ask why someone was still wearing jewelry in the bath. And under no circumstances did anyone point out if someone began snoring in the steam room. These unspoken codes were enforced not with reprimands, but with long silences and subtle, lingering glances. The church, meanwhile, remained deeply suspicious of bathhouses. Spending hours lounging unclothed with strangers was seen by some priests as a shortcut to moral decline. Bathhouses, they argued, blurred the boundary between need and temptation. A few clergy went as far as labeling frequent bathing an act of vanity, one that flirted dangerously close to heresy. Naturally, this only made bathhouses more popular. When plagues or outbreaks swept through towns, bathhouses were often the first public spaces to be shut down, blamed for helping disease spread. Ironically, some towns responded by leaning even harder into bathing, encouraging citizens to scrub themselves with vinegar or soak in wine-laced baths in a desperate attempt to ward off contagion. Whether it worked or not is still up for debate, but what's certain is that it made for some very costly laundry. For the poorer townspeople, bathhouses weren't just about hygiene. They were a rare escape, a temporary refuge from cramped homes and filthy alleys. Inside those fog-filled rooms, one could briefly forget about taxes, field work, or the rat that had recently claimed squatters' rights in the family pantry. There was warmth, there was music, there was laughter, and for a few moments, the world felt softer, even manageable. And it wasn't just a place for hygiene and community. Bathhouses gave rise to folklore. Songs were sung about love stories born in the steam. Poems mourned betrayals whispered during back scrubbings. One apocryphal tale tells of a nobleman who, during a particularly vigorous massage, accidentally proposed marriage to the wrong person. They were wed 3 days later. Reportedly, it worked out fine. Even the architecture had its quirks. Floors were sloped toward drains, when drains existed. Some drains led nowhere useful, ending abruptly at a wall, which meant the water simply pooled until someone noticed or slipped. Walls were built thick to hold in heat and keep out peeping eyes. Ceilings were low to trap steam, and they often dripped ominously, sometimes in rhythm with the lute music playing outside. Bathhouses even earned nicknames, affectionate and sarcastic in equal measure. The lukewarm barrel, St. Steam's, the mutton broth, or the place where I lost my sock and my dignity. These were more than buildings. They were characters in the life of the town, as central to daily rhythm as the market square or the church bell. You could even chart the seasons by listening to the chatter inside. Spring brought complaints about muddy roads. Summer came with sandal blisters and rumors of traveling performers. Autumn arrived alongside tax talk and unsolicited cabbage recipes. Winter meant fewer bathers, more firewood, and a shared, deliberate silence pretending the roof wasn't leaking. The bathhouse had its own language too. To be pickled meant staying too long. To be tub-wise meant knowing exactly which bench wouldn't collapse. Going full splash referred to someone bathing with such enthusiasm that others discreetly cleared the room. These phrases varied from place to place, but the spirit behind them stayed the same. Shared spaces made for shared stories. In the end, the bathhouse wasn't only about washing bodies. It was about reordering a rough day, scrubbing the edges off life's daily indignities. It was about shared heat, shared water, shared humanity. No matter how imperfect, how crowded, or how questionably clean, bathhouses mattered. They mattered because they offered people something rare, a fleeting moment of stillness, a moment of visibility, a moment when the world didn't reek quite so strongly of wet wool and resignation. And in medieval Europe, that was something worth soaking in. Within the grand hierarchy of medieval hygiene horrors, the scalp held a special distinction. Hair was everywhere, long, tangled, braided, hidden beneath veils or proudly displayed, prayed over, envied, cursed. Sometimes it was even weaponized with vinegar. Despite its social importance, taking care of hair was a laborious contradiction. People wanted their hair to look decent, if not beautiful, then at least socially tolerable. But they also lived in fear of what might be crawling inside it. Because where there was hair, there were almost certainly lice. And where there were lice, there were stories. The medieval approach to washing hair was cautious at best. Full-on shampooing, as we know it today, was rare. Hair was washed only occasionally, often just before major religious festivals or important events like weddings and public ceremonies. For most, clean hair didn't mean freshly washed. It meant it had been dusted, braided, maybe perfumed. When water was used, it was never poured thoughtlessly. Hot water, they believed, opened the pores on the scalp and invited illness, or worse, disobedient spirits. So cold or lukewarm rinses were the safer standard. Before any washing began, the hair was thoroughly combed, sometimes for hours. Combs made of wood, bone, or horn weren't just for detangling. They were also used to dislodge lice, nits, and other small surprises best left unspoken. One popular method involved soaking the comb in vinegar or rose water. The acidity, it was believed, weakened the lice's grip and possibly their will to live. The vinegar weakened the lice's grip and perhaps their will to live. After combing, the hair might be rinsed with a warm herbal infusion. Chamomile to add shine, rosemary to promote strength, or nettle if, by chance, someone had recently angered a hedge witch. Soaps were rarely applied directly to the scalp. They were simply too harsh and often left behind a stubborn residue that transformed hair into a stiff, slightly flammable helmet. For those with longer hair, especially women, the challenge only deepened. Hair was both a point of pride and a logistical puzzle. Braiding was as fashionable as it was practical. It kept hair neat, contained wild volume, and most importantly, made lice easier to detect. Braiding styles themselves communicated subtle social cues, status, marital availability, or even regional identity. Loose, unbraided hair, on the other hand, was sometimes considered improper, unless one was in mourning, or perhaps standing in a doorway dramatically cursing someone in Latin. Head coverings played a role too. Most adults wore some form of covering: hats, veils, coifs, kerchiefs, not just for modesty or fashion, but as shields against dust, smoke, and the ever-present risk of wandering insects. These coverings were changed far more often than the hair beneath them was washed. In fact, with a well-made linen cap and a decent comb, one could go an impressively long time without ever touching a bucket of water. Of course, not all treatments were gentle. Some involved massaging mashed garlic or raw onion into the scalp. Others recommended goose grease, chicken fat, or warm vinegar blended with ash. One curious remedy involved soaking a piece of bread in wine, applying it to the scalp, and leaving it there until the wine evaporated, or until the person was quietly removed from polite society. Scholars still debate whether any of this worked, or if it simply encouraged the lice to relocate to less pungent hosts. Children were especially vulnerable. Their scalps were thinner, their habits messier, and their patience for combing nearly non-existent. Parents sometimes used herbal compresses to reduce itching, or to distract from the horror of whatever was being pulled from behind their ears. In schools, lice inspections were not uncommon. These sessions involved wooden sticks, stern glances, and a rising tide of communal shame. Monks and clergy took a different route. Many wore tonsures, patches of hair shaved as part of religious tradition. This practice made lice easier to spot and harder to hide, which, depending on one's perspective, was either a spiritual blessing or a form of divine punishment. Still, monasteries weren't immune to infestations. Communal living, shared pillows, and vows of silence created ideal conditions for quiet, determined parasites. Hair styling did exist, though it demanded a fair amount of bravery. Pomades made from animal fat, soot, or even honey were used to control frizz and add shine, though they also attracted both compliments and insects. One noblewoman famously used a paste of egg yolk and crushed herbs to give her hair volume. It worked, until a sweltering summer day turned her carefully sculpted coif into something closer to a baked frittata. No one ever looked at her the same way again. Barbers offered scalp care, though the results varied wildly. Some were skilled at trimming, delousing, and styling. Others leaned more toward bloodletting, tooth extractions, and unsolicited lectures on the human condition. In larger towns, barber surgeons operated out of bathhouses, cutting hair in the same steamy rooms where people soaked their regrets. Dandruff, meanwhile, was treated with dry powders, chalk, crushed eggshells, ground herbs, the goal being to soak up oils and reduce itching, not necessarily to resolve anything. Flakes were a fact of life, like cracked hands in winter or mystery bruises from medieval furniture. For the truly wealthy, options expanded. Imported oils from the Mediterranean, scented waters from the East, and delicate silk wraps were used to preserve hairstyles overnight. Some nobles even slept on pillows stuffed with fragrant herbs, letting lavender and rosemary perfume their dreams. If you could afford luxury, hair became a canvas for ambition. If you couldn't, it remained a battleground between beauty and bugs. Seasons brought their own hair struggles. In summer, sun and sweat left hair brittle. In winter, fireplace smoke clung to every strand. Spring meant mud, and autumn meant static. Even the cleanest heads eventually surrendered to the will of nature and its six-legged tenants. Still, hair was deeply personal, tied to one's identity. People admired thick, healthy locks. Poets wrote odes to flaxen braids and raven curls. Saints were remembered for their miraculous tresses. Hair was cut and offered to lovers, burned in rituals, or carried as talismans. Losing one's hair, whether to age, illness, or infestation, felt like a personal loss, almost a spiritual defeat. In literature and legend, hair carried powerful meaning. A knight might wear a lady's hair around his wrist as a token of loyalty. A widow might shear hers in mourning. A healer might request a strand to lift a curse or locate a missing child. Hair wasn't just a cosmetic detail, it was part of the soul's packaging. And then there were wigs. Not common in the 1200s, but used occasionally by performers, tricksters, and those with something to conceal. These wigs were rough, made of real hair stitched into cloth caps or glued onto scraps of fabric. They were itchy, heavy, and flammable, everything one could want in a poorly thought-out disguise. As hygiene gradually improved across regions, so too did the perception of hair. Clean, well-kept hair became a sign of discipline and virtue. Greasy, unwashed hair, unless perfumed into submission, was taken as a sign of neglect. Still, without easy access to water, soap, or time, most people did what they could. They combed, they braided, they wrapped, and they hoped. Some wore tiny pouches of herbs or charms tucked into their hair, spiritual armor meant to ward off disease, misfortune, or nosy neighbors. A hairdo could be both a fashion statement and a line of defense. Pins carved from bone held it all together. Even in death, hair mattered. The deceased were sometimes buried with their combs. Their hair was washed with holy water and brushed one last time by grieving relatives. This final grooming was a quiet act of dignity, a preparation for whatever came next. Because whether living or departed, one truth remained. The state of your scalp said something about the state of your soul. In the end, hair hygiene wasn't about achieving perfection. It was about effort. It was ritual. It was burden. It was badge. It itched. It tangled. It rebelled. But it also spoke volumes about care, about identity, and about the enduring hope of facing the world with your head held high, even if something was crawling on it. And if you ever find yourself silently giving thanks for modern dental floss, take a moment to consider the medieval mouth. Oral hygiene in the 1200s wasn't science. It was survival. Teeth mattered. They were used to cut food, crack nuts, and occasionally bite one's enemies. But how people cared for them, that was another matter entirely. Inconsistent, experimental, and often painful. Still, most people did clean their teeth, of sorts. It wasn't outright neglect. It was limited knowledge. The modern toothbrush wouldn't arrive in Europe for centuries. Instead, people used chewing sticks, twigs from aromatic trees like hazel, licorice, or walnut. One end would be frayed into brush-like fibers, and this makeshift bristle was rubbed back and forth across the teeth in repetitive strokes, scraping off food particles, plaque, and perhaps a few regrets from the week prior. To complement the chew stick, some used cloth, typically a scrap of linen wrapped around the finger. This could be dipped into a cleansing mixture and used to scrub directly. The contents of these mixtures varied wildly depending on region and bravery. Popular blends included crushed charcoal and coarse salt. Others combined dried mint, rosemary, ash, and occasionally powdered bone. These abrasive powders worked well to scour the teeth, leaving behind a matte surface that felt smoother and appeared cleaner. Of course, no one fully understood enamel back then, which meant regular use of such scouring agents often wore it down entirely. But that didn't matter. What people valued was the immediate sensation of a clean mouth, whether or not it was built to last. People valued the sensation of a clean mouth far more than the long-term integrity of their teeth. If the teeth looked white and felt smooth, that was considered a success, even if the gums had already begun to retreat like a frightened rabbit in a thunderstorm. Bad breath, or halitosis, was a real social concern. Remedies were plentiful. Chewing parsley was a common trick. Others sucked on cloves, anise seeds, or fennel to freshen their breath. The wealthier classes carried pomanders, small, ornate metal balls filled with perfumed herbs, which they held discreetly near their faces during conversation. Some chewed on cardamom pods or dried ginger, not only to sweeten their breath, but also to mask the underlying bouquet of fermented onions and slow-moving dental decay. Dentistry did exist, but it was rudimentary at best. Toothaches were first treated with poultices, onion juice, vinegar, mashed leeks, applied directly to the gums. Clove oil, where available, was treasured for its numbing effect. If none of these worked, the tooth had to go. There were no anesthetics. The extraction was performed by a barber surgeon, or whoever was brave enough to hold a pair of pliers and not flinch at the screaming. The tools were terrifying. Chief among them was the dental key, a miniature meat hook designed to wrench a tooth free with a swift, violent twist. In skilled hands, it was brutal but mercifully quick. In unskilled ones, the patient risked broken teeth, shattered jawbones, and a lifelong suspicion of anyone holding metal. Preventative dentistry leaned heavily on superstition. Some believed that toothaches were caused by worms, tiny, invisible creatures that bored into enamel and fed on pain. To drive them out, people smoked their mouths with burning henbane, garlic, or any herb foul enough to make even a worm reconsider. The goal was to suffocate the invaders, or at least encourage them to migrate towards someone more tolerable. Diet played a significant role in dental health. Sugar was almost non-existent and outrageously expensive. Honey was the primary sweetener, and while it did cause some decay, it wasn't nearly as destructive as the cane sugar that would later devastate Renaissance molars. Most medieval diets revolved around coarse bread, porridge, vegetables, and meat, all of which required aggressive chewing. That chewing, in turn, helped keep the jaw strong and may have naturally scrubbed teeth to a degree. But there was a downside. Bread often contained grit from poorly milled flour, tiny stone fragments that wore down enamel over time. This constant abrasion could eventually expose nerves, leading to painful infections. And with no antibiotics in sight, what started as a small cavity could end as a slow, smoldering death sentence delivered directly into the bloodstream. Gum disease was also rampant. Swollen, bleeding gums were considered a normal part of aging. Some people rinsed their mouths with vinegar or rubbed crushed mint into their gums. Others turned to prayer. Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of toothaches, received countless whispered appeals from desperate peasants, clutching swollen faces and bargaining with heaven for just one more pain-free morning. Tooth loss was both common and expected. A young adult might begin life with a full smile, but by middle age, noticeable gaps were the norm. False teeth existed, but were rare. Some were made of bone or ivory and tied into the mouth with cords. Others were made from the teeth of animals or other, less fortunate humans. These prosthetics were deeply uncomfortable and mostly decorative, worn by nobles during court appearances, then discreetly removed the moment the spotlight faded. Still, people smiled. They laughed at bad breath. They teased one another about their whistling gaps. Tooth powders were even gifted like little tokens of care. Mint sprigs were passed around like breath mints. Couples sometimes chewed herbs together before a feast, knowing full well that roasted garlic would be waiting on the table. Oral hygiene, though unscientific, was a reflection of cultural values. People cared how they smelled. They cared how they looked. They cared whether their smile was acceptable, even if it took salt, sand, vinegar, and denial to get there. It was a system built on intuition, trial and error, and a shared sense of stubborn hope. Monasteries contributed as well. Monks maintained gardens filled with sage, mint, and hyssop, herbs believed to strengthen gums and ease pain. Their handwritten manuscripts preserved recipes for treating mouth rot, tooth demons, and hot teeth, terms we now interpret as everything from gingivitis to full abscesses. Treatments included gargling with warm wine, applying herbal poultices, or simply fasting and hoping that divine mercy would intervene. In towns, traveling tooth pullers were both feared and welcomed. They arrived in brightly colored coats, carrying bags of tools, and promising both pain relief and entertainment. Setting up in town squares or market stalls, they offered free consultations and pulled teeth while cracking jokes or playing music. Children watched in horror. Adults watched, too, hoping the spectacle might distract from the inevitable agony. Illustrations from the time depict these tooth pullers as grotesque caricatures, yanking teeth from wide-eyed victims mid-scream. And yet, their business thrived. Pain was universal, and if someone could take it away, even temporarily, the fashion crimes and questionable ethics were usually forgiven. Tooth charms were also popular. Some wore animal teeth around their necks to ward off decay. Others kept written spells or hung small bones beside their beds to keep nighttime jaw pain at bay. These rituals lived somewhere between medicine and magic. No one really understood how teeth worked, but everyone understood just how much they could hurt. By modern standards, medieval dental hygiene was a nightmare. But judged within the context of its time, its knowledge, tools, and beliefs, it was a strangely admirable form of perseverance. People didn't give up on their teeth. They fought for them, with herbs, sticks, powders, prayers, and the occasional scream muffled by a linen rag. And there's something strangely beautiful in that. In a world without toothpaste, ergonomic brushes, or dental insurance, medieval people still tried. They worked with what they had. They improvised. They endured. And when the pain became unbearable, they sought out the man with the iron hook and the steady hand. Even that, in its terrifying honesty, was a kind of self-care. If medieval hygiene had a face, it probably shimmered faintly beneath a mask of crushed pearls, curdled milk, and something that smelled suspiciously like roasted rodent. Skincare in the 1200s was an unpredictable blend of superstition, trial-and-error chemistry, and dangerous optimism. People wanted to look healthy. The problem wasn't just figuring out how to look healthy. It was that no one really agreed on what healthy even meant. Or, for that matter, how much mercury was too much. Pale skin was the height of fashion. It signaled wealth, leisure, and the luxury of staying indoors, far away from the sun-drenched fields where peasants toiled. Tan skin, by contrast, was linked to labor and low status. Naturally, people went to great and dangerous lengths to look pale. They coated their faces with lead. Literally. One of the most popular preparations was Venetian ceruse, a whitening paste made from white lead mixed with vinegar. When applied, it created a matte, ghostly finish that practically screamed, "I'm rich, refined, and very possibly dying." Over time, the lead absorbed into the skin, causing tremors, muscle weakness, and in many cases, permanent disfigurement. The irony was hard to miss. The more someone tried to appear flawless, the more their face cracked and peeled like an old piece of wallpaper. Mercury was another favorite. Yes, the same shimmering silver poison that would horrify any modern scientist. It was used in creams and salves, thought to heal infections, erase blemishes, and smooth away imperfections. In practice, it also erased chunks of memory, coordination, and eventually the ability to finish a sentence without blinking in Morse code. Still, these ingredients were beloved. Recipes were passed from noblewoman to noblewoman, tucked into small books alongside love charms and pickling tips. Other skin treatments were slightly less toxic and a lot more edible. Some involved masks made from egg whites. Others used crushed rose petals blended with chalk. Goat milk was rubbed into the cheeks to add softness. Bread soaked in ale was applied to sunburns. If it was remotely food-like, someone, somewhere, probably rubbed it on their face. Even mouse fat had its moment. It was combined with powdered sage to treat dry patches and soften calluses. Some instructions specified the fat of a black mouse, rendered under a full moon. Probably more for drama than chemistry. Still, someone did it, and told their friends it worked wonders. Honey was a more respectable option. It was used to treat wounds, moisturize skin, and boasted natural antibacterial properties and a sweet scent. Unfortunately, it also attracted bees, ants, and any other creature with a nose. Those brave enough to persist insisted that being chased by hornets was a fair trade for radiant skin. Oils were essential. Olive oil was prized for hydration, if you could afford it. Almond oil appeared in perfumed balms. Even rendered animal fats, pig, duck, and yes, mouse, were smeared onto dry limbs, often scented with herbs to mask their more aggressive aromas. Scrubs were common, too. People mixed ground seeds, flour, crushed eggshells, or ash into thick pastes to exfoliate dead skin and uncover the softer layer beneath. In practice, the results were mixed. Some emerged glowing, others red and blotchy, regretting all their life choices. Sun protection wasn't scientific, it was spiritual. Some believed that amulets or prayers could prevent sunburn. Others relied on physical barriers, wide hoods, layered veils, or hats with drooping flaps. Those who could afford parasols used them. Peasants, on the other hand, made do with whatever was at hand: shawls, baskets, even the nearest chicken, anything to block the sun. Freckles, considered charming today, were frowned upon among the wealthy. They hinted at sun exposure, which was taboo. Treatments ranged from lemon juice dabs to vinegar mixed with salt. One bizarre remedy involved applying the blood of a rabbit killed during a lunar eclipse. Whether it worked is still debated, but it definitely showed commitment. Warts, blemishes, and moles had layered reputations. In some regions, a mole was a lucky sign. In others, a warning of witchcraft. People tried to remove them with hot irons, knives, or crushed plantain poultices. Some, wisely, just wore bigger hats. Acne was tackled with everything from cabbage water to powdered coral. The understanding of skin conditions was extremely limited, so most treatments focused on cooling the blood or drawing out heat. Mint was a favorite. Crushed cucumber came in a close second, though it was often just an excuse to stick lunch on your face. Scarring was common, whether from smallpox, injuries, or failed beauty experiments. Some people tried to cover them with wax-based balms. Others wore veils or cloths across their faces. In some circles, a scar was noble, a sign of survival, of plague, or battle. In others, it was a flaw to be hidden away. Perfume was used to distract from whatever lay beneath. Floral waters, especially rose and lavender, were dabbed behind the ears or across the wrists. Scented sachets were tucked into garments. When soap did exist, it was prized more for fragrance than function. A rose-scented bar might sit untouched in a drawer, quietly judging everything else you did. Men weren't exempt from the skincare game. Most didn't wear creams openly, but many used ointments for sunburn, shaving rashes, or battlefield wounds. Knights carried balms in their kits. Hunters rubbed juniper on their cheeks for good luck and fewer bug bites. Squires often inherited skin remedies right alongside their armor polish and their master's debts. Aging was accepted, but not without resistance. Wrinkles were massaged with warm oil. Gray hair was dyed with plant-based tinctures, henna, walnut shells, and iron filings steeped in vinegar. The result was rarely subtle, but if you could tolerate the smell, you might just pass for a younger version of yourself. Looking truly youthful wasn't the goal. Just looking like time hadn't kicked you too hard was enough. Interestingly, many people connected skin quality to moral character. Smooth, pale skin suggested piety, cleanliness, and inner discipline. Rough, sun-darkened skin was unfairly linked to impulsiveness or sin. This bias led to harsh stereotypes. Peasants were often seen as less pure, simply because they had melanin and outdoor responsibilities. Monasteries also played a role in skincare. Monks and nuns kept meticulous records of herbal salves and poultices, using garden-grown ingredients like calendula, sage, yarrow, and comfrey. Some of their recipes still survive today, offering surprisingly effective treatments for burns, bug bites, and rashes. But despite all the effort, skincare remained wildly inconsistent. What soothed one face could inflame another. What worked on one body might scald the next. Most treatments were built around humoral theory, balancing hot and cold, wet and dry. If your skin ran hot, you needed something cooling. If it was dry, you needed fat. If your nose turned blue, you probably needed to lie down and rethink your entire strategy. And still, people cared. They fussed, they compared, they whispered recipes passed down from grandmothers, midwives, and wandering merchants. They stared into polished copper mirrors and poked at spots. They plucked stray hairs with bone tweezers. They lit candles and examined their reflections, not with vanity, but with stubborn hope. Because even in a world without dermatologists, there remained a deep human desire to feel good in your own skin. Even if that skin was slick with lard and faintly scented with lavender and regret. In the 1200s, clothes weren't about expression. They were about survival. A tunic wasn't just an outfit. It was insulation, modesty, bedding, a napkin, a towel, and sometimes even a blanket for your goat. Most people owned very few garments, often just one or two sets. And when a single piece of clothing had to do all that work, it didn't get washed often. Certainly not every week. Usually not even every month. Washing clothes was a monumental task. It required hauling water, sometimes for great distances, heating it if possible, and scrubbing fabrics with sand, lye, or ashes. There were no detergents, no machines, no such thing as a gentle cycle. Everything was done by hand, usually outdoors, and in whatever stream, basin, or patch of riverbank you could claim for an afternoon. This wasn't just a chore, it was a full-blown ordeal. Clothes were washed only when they became visibly filthy, smelled like they'd attended a livestock parade, or began developing their own political views. If you could afford linen undergarments, those were the items cleaned most often. Being worn close to the skin, they soaked up sweat and oils. A linen shirt might get washed a few times a month if you were diligent. Overclothes, especially woolen tunics, were another story entirely. Wool was thick, slow to dry, and alarmingly prone to shrinking. Instead of washing it, people would hang it out to air, beat the dust out with sticks, or suspend it above burning herbs in the hope that smoke could succeed where soap would not. Drying clothes brought its own set of struggles. There were no picturesque laundry lines stretching across manicured gardens. Clothes were draped over bushes, hedgerows, or laid flat on warm stones. Sometimes they were flung across wooden fences. Occasionally, they ended up on livestock pens, leading to the unfortunate, and not uncommon, situation of a sheep walking off with someone's only pair of breeches. Soap, when available, was harsh and unforgiving. Made from animal fat and lye, it stung the skin and left hands raw. Washwomen developed calluses thick enough to knock on doors. Some used ash instead. Others employed fermented urine, which, thanks to its ammonia content, was considered particularly effective for whitening linen. Collecting that urine was a social task few volunteered for twice. Clothing repair was more common than actual washing. Garments were patched, stitched, and reinforced long before they were ever fully laundered. Needles and thread were precious. Some families shared a single needle, guarding it with the reverence of a sacred relic. Darning socks became an evening ritual. Adding a patch wasn't a mark of shame. It was a sign of thrift. A tunic sewn from 5 different scraps wasn't an eyesore. It was a timeline. Dyes, when used, were unreliable. Most everyday clothing came in browns, grays, and dull earth tones. Bright colors required expensive ingredients. Indigo for rich blues, woad for a cheaper variant, madder for red. These dyes faded quickly, bled when wet, and, if improperly prepared, could poison the wearer. Still, people tried. Even a faint yellow from boiled onion skins was preferable to the bleak palette of potato fog. Most villagers wore what they were allowed. Sumptuary laws dictated which fabrics and colors different classes could use. In some regions, peasants were forbidden from wearing certain shades or using silk, even if they somehow acquired it. These restrictions weren't about money. They were about keeping everyone in their designated place. A poor man in red might be accused of impersonating nobility. A rich man in plain wool might be praised for humility or suspected of dodging his creditors. Washing days were communal events. Women gathered near rivers or wells, scrubbing garments on flat stones or crude wooden washboards. They exchanged gossip and recipes while trying to prevent toddlers from tumbling into the water. Songs were often sung, not just for tradition, but to keep rhythm and drown out the sound of sore backs and numb hands. When wool absolutely had to be cleaned, it had to be handled with great care. Hot water would shrink it. Cold water wouldn't clean it. Washing wool became a delicate dance of soaking, beating, temperature control, and whispered prayers. Most people avoided it altogether. A wool tunic might go unwashed for a year, simply aired out and brushed down with a stiff straw broom. Storage was minimal. Few homes had wardrobes or chests. Clothes were folded or rolled and placed on wooden shelves, hung on wall pegs, or stashed under beds. Some people dangled their garments from ceiling rafters, where smoke from the hearth supposedly kept pests away. Others stuffed spare clothes into sacks and used them as makeshift cushions. Multi-purpose furniture was a medieval norm. Undergarments were more common among the wealthy. A noblewoman might wear a linen shift beneath her gown, not just for comfort, but to protect the outer layer from sweat and skin oils. These shifts were often embroidered around the neckline and cuffs, so they could peek out without appearing plain. And because these were the layers washed most often, they helped create the illusion that the wearer was far cleaner than they actually were. Footwear was another matter. Shoes were rarely cleaned. They were made of leather, cloth, or wood, and were expected to absorb their fair share of the countryside. Some were lined with fur. Others were stuffed with straw. Most were worn down, reshaped, patched, and passed along until holes outnumbered stitches. Clean shoes were a luxury. The average pair was dried when wet, then smacked against the wall to evict whatever had taken up residence inside. In wealthier homes, laundry was the domain of servants, usually women, tasked with the back-breaking labor of scrubbing, boiling, wringing, and drying every garment in the household. The smell of laundry day in a castle courtyard was unmistakable. Hot wool, scorched lye, and lavender locked in a losing battle. If a noblewoman smelled fresh and looked radiant, it was because several other women had spent hours standing waist-deep in soapy water, muttering curses between loads. Clothes also carried meaning. A clean tunic worn to church suggested moral order. A ragged hemline might speak to either hardship or humility. Bright embroidery was a language of its own. It could signal wealth, lineage, or hometown pride. Specific motifs, geometric patterns, floral emblems, or animal shapes were passed down through generations, stitched into cuffs and collars. A shirt wasn't just a garment. It could be a message, a marker, a shield. For children, clothing was often made from whatever scraps were available. Babies were swaddled in leftover linen. As they grew, they inherited hand-me-downs from older siblings, neighbors, or even the recently deceased. These hand-me-downs weren't a sign of poverty. They were proof of belonging, evidence of a long, frayed lineage stitched together with thread and care. In winter, people didn't swap garments. They added layers. Cloaks, mantles, shawls, caps, anything to keep warm. Cleanliness wasn't the goal. Survival was. If that meant smelling like a sheep that had fallen into a chimney, so be it. In summer, layers were shed, but modesty still ruled. Even a peasant sweating in the fields kept their sleeves on and their heads covered. Not for fashion, but for sun protection, tradition, and propriety. And yet, through all the dirt, repetition, and fading colors, people still took pride in their clothing. They mended carefully. They brushed away stains. They folded their few belongings with intention. A neatly folded tunic could feel like order. A freshly dried linen shift, still slightly warm from the fire, could feel like renewal. In a world where everything seemed to rot quickly, fabric remembered. Stitches marked effort. Patterns told stories. And colors, even faded ones, whispered of sunlight, of soap, of survival. Step into a 13th century town with your nose held high, and you'll regret it immediately. Scent wasn't just part of medieval life. It was survival. Fragrance carried meaning, masked sins, and functioned as both social signal and spiritual armor. A person's smell said more than their clothing or their accent ever could. And sometimes, it said things they would have preferred to keep secret. At a base level, everyone had a smell. Bathing was rare. Laundry even rarer. People lived in close quarters with animals. They cooked over smoky fires and used the bathroom wherever gravity allowed. The result was a dense, layered scentscape that clung to skin, clothing, and walls. It wasn't just the smell of sweat and soot. It was the smell of humanity, raw, fermented, and deeply personal. To fight back, people turned to herbs. Lavender, rosemary, sage, and mint were the champions of the medieval scent world. These herbs were hung from ceiling beams, stuffed into pillows, or sewn into sachets worn under the clothing. A typical sachet might hold dried petals, cinnamon bark, cloves, or even a shard of resin. These weren't just for fragrance. They were talismans against disease, misfortune, and sometimes other people. Among the wealthy, pomanders were the trend. These were hollow, often spherical containers made from precious metals, worn on belts or necklaces. Inside was a potent mix of substances: ambergris, musk, civet, and floral oils. Ambergris came from the digestive system of whales. Musk was harvested from glands belonging to animals no one wanted to meet twice. Civet was extracted from cat-like creatures who surely didn't enjoy the process. Despite their unsettling origins, these ingredients were highly valued and sold at exorbitant prices. When blended properly, they produced rich, earthy, lingering scents, remarkably good at covering up everything else. The smell of damp wool and questionable decisions hung in the air. To combat it, people turned to burning herbs, a practice known as fumigation. It was equal parts purification ritual and medieval air freshener. Juniper, frankincense, and myrrh were burned not only in homes, but also in churches and occasionally right out on the street. The smoke was believed to cleanse the air, drive out disease, and lift the spirits. It also had the more immediate benefit of covering the stench of rotting food, overflowing chamber pots, and livestock-based traffic jams. Clothing, too, could be perfumed. The wealthy sometimes owned gloves scented with floral oils or powdered spices. Linen handkerchiefs were infused with rose water. Cloaks might be discreetly lined with small sachets stitched into the seams. In some households, entire rooms were perfumed by boiling orange peels or cloves on the hearth. But it wasn't just about masking odor. Certain scents were believed to protect the body. Disease, particularly the plague, was thought to travel through foul air, known as miasma. Keeping sweet-smelling herbs near the nose was believed to purify the air before it reached the lungs. Physicians famously wore beaked masks stuffed with aromatic herbs, trusting that the curved snout would filter out illness. Those with fewer resources simply tucked lavender into their sleeves and hoped it would be enough. Even hygiene rituals had their own scent etiquette. After washing, people rubbed their skin with scented oils, not just to soften it, but to add a pleasing fragrance. Popular scents included rose, almond, and violet. These oils were typically homemade, created by steeping petals in olive or nut oils, then storing them in ceramic or glass containers. The bottles were reused again and again, and over time the scent intensified, for better or worse. Noble homes were often scented, deliberately or accidentally. Floors were covered with rushes and strewn with herbs, creating a kind of rustic carpeting and releasing scent with every step. Though these rushes were changed only semi-regularly, the combination of crushed plants and whatever else fell to the floor gave each home its own distinctive olfactory signature. Some homes smelled of sage and roast meat. Others reeked of mildew and raw ambition. Markets had their own perfumes, too. The butcher's stall, the fishmonger's buckets, the herb vendor's baskets, the baker's oven smoke. Each corner of town carried a different scent. For medieval townsfolk, navigation wasn't just visual. You could often find your way home by smell, assuming the wind was favorable and no one had dumped anything dreadful into the street that day. Fragrance changed with the seasons. Spring brought the smell of mud, fresh flowers, and damp sheep. Summer was sweat mingled with ripe fruit and neighbors of questionable freshness. Autumn carried the earthy perfume of fallen leaves, fermenting cider, and decomposing market leftovers. Winter smelled of smoke, wet cloaks, and whatever had embedded itself in your scarf since the last washing. Scent was also a crucial part of courtship. A pleasant fragrance could be more persuasive than poetry. Lovers exchanged scented tokens, handkerchiefs, sprigs of mint, or locks of hair wrapped in rosemary. A well-perfumed visitor might be welcomed warmly. A foul-smelling one would likely be offered the stool closest to the door. Scent could even be weaponized. Enemies were accused of carrying bad luck via body odor. Suspected witches were said to possess strange or lingering smells. Conversely, saints were believed to emit floral scents even after death, a phenomenon known as the odor of sanctity. Stories circulated about corpses that smelled of roses weeks after burial. The implication was divine favor, or at the very least, impressively fragrant posthumous hygiene. Religious rituals relied heavily on scent. Incense was burned during mass, processions, and feast days. The fragrance was meant to lift prayers heavenward and create a sensory divide between the sacred and the mundane. For peasants crowded in the back pews, the incense also helped mask the collective smell of humanity, which, in its own way, was an act of grace. Children added their own notes to the medieval scent symphony. Babies were swaddled in layers of rarely changed fabric. Herbs were often tucked between the folds to balance out nature's less charming aromas. Mothers chewed mint or fennel before nursing, believing it would calm the child or improve the taste of the milk. Some infants wore tiny garlands of rosemary, part blessing, part olfactory survival strategy for whoever had to carry them on long journeys. Animals made their contributions as well. Horses, oxen, chickens, and goats all had a place in the household, sometimes literally. During cold months, livestock often slept indoors, their smells blending with smoke, straw, and wool into a scent that was oddly comforting if you grew up with it, and utterly horrifying if you hadn't. Class played a role in scent, too. Nobility had access to imported spices, perfumed oils, and private baths. Their scent profiles leaned floral, resinous, or citrusy. The poor smelled of sweat, smoke, and earth. But even peasants took steps to improve their aroma. He might not have rose water, but he had fresh mint from the garden, a clean shirt warmed by the hearth, and the good sense to stand downwind from judgment. Fragrance marked every major life milestone. Births were celebrated with incense. Weddings were adorned with flower garlands. Funerals included the burning of herbs, to ease the soul's departure and prevent the living from fainting. Each of life's major events had a smell, one that often lingered in memory long after the details had faded. Fragrance, in medieval Europe, wasn't a luxury. It was a thread running through every layer of life, binding identity, health, belief, and memory together. People lived surrounded by scent, shaped by it, guarded by it. They wore it like armor, traded it like treasure, and feared it like poison. No one in the 1200s smelled like a daisy, but some carried daisies anyway, tucked behind an ear or stitched into a cuff, hoping that beauty might, just for a moment, overpower biology. In the medieval world, feet were not sacred. They were not delicate. They were not serenaded in poems or admired in portraits. Feet were tools, battered, calloused, and ignored until something went terribly wrong. They carried people over farmland, into marketplaces, through homes, across borders, and all the way to distant pilgrimage sites, usually without thanks, and often without shoes. When footwear was available, it was rudimentary, little more than stitched leather coverings shaped vaguely like the human foot, offering about as much arch support as a folded cabbage leaf. A cobbler could craft a custom pair, but the result still felt like a compromise between a shoe and a cry for help. Socks, as we know them today, didn't exist for most people. Wealthier individuals might own hose, close-fitting leg coverings made of linen or wool, but these often left the feet bare or only half-covered. Most people wrapped their feet in strips of cloth, primitive foot wraps wound around ankles for warmth and padding. But they needed frequent rewrapping or they would bunch, slip, or rub blisters into your skin. A poorly wrapped foot could turn a routine walk to the village mill into a week-long hobble. To keep warm, people stuffed straw, moss, or feathers into their shoes. These materials absorbed sweat, then sat there, marinating quietly until they were pulled out, discarded, or replaced. The term fresh was always relative. If the straw inside your shoes had dried overnight by the hearth, that counted. Shoes were not waterproof, far from it. Leather absorbed moisture, seams leaked, and a single rainy day meant soggy shoes, soggier feet, and cold toes. Left unchecked, this quickly led to the development of fungal colonies worthy of their own feudal titles. In an effort to repel water, people sometimes greased their shoes with animal fat, beeswax, or pitch. The result was often short-lived success, followed by sticky ankles, ruined floor mats, and the occasional go-of-foot care in the medieval world was almost entirely reactive. As long as feet functioned, they were ignored. When something went wrong, treatment began. Cuts were rinsed with wine or vinegar. Bruises were wrapped in warm cloth. Sores were lanced and drained, sometimes with the same knives used to carve breakfast. Preventive care was virtually non-existent, unless you counted muttering a prayer before stepping into a muddy lane paved with broken tiles, and in blisters were treated with poultices, honey and ash, mashed herbs, or tufts of wool soaked in beer. The beer method was particularly popular, though whether it had any medicinal value or simply provided a distraction remains unclear. Chronic foot pain led people to visit local healers, who might prescribe warm foot baths with rosemary or thyme. Some believed in bloodletting, under the logic that removing excess fluids would restore internal balance. Others recommended rest, elevation, or, if hope was running thin, a pilgrimage to a distant monastery rumored to own a sandal once worn by Saint Sebastian. Cracked heels were so widespread, they barely counted as a condition. The skin dried, split, healed, and split again in a cycle of endurance. People rubbed animal fat or beeswax into the fissures, hoping for relief. Others tied pieces of raw cabbage over the cracks. If it worked, great. If not, the cabbage went into the stew pot, and the cracks where toenail care was a private affair. Nails were trimmed with knives, chipped with stones, or gnawed by those with flexible morals and excellent balance. Overgrown nails led to curled growth, painful infections, and gruesome ingrown scenarios. Remedies ranged from slicing away the offending nail to wrapping it in vinegar-soaked cloth and waiting for it to fall off in shame. Foot odor was not only accepted, it was expected. People washed their feet in mint water or rubbed them with sage or crushed pine needles. The freshness lasted about an hour. After that, the natural scent of toil and persistence returned with authority. Jokes followed, of course. The road follows his feet because it fears the smell, and similar friendly barbs. But truly offensive odor was a communal concern. Neighbors might leave bundles of herbs, suggest a foot bath, or, if all else failed, avoid eye contact entirely. Children's feet were often bare, especially in warmer months. They ran freely through meadows, dung heaps, and shallow streams, collecting a steady stream of cuts, scrapes, and mystery rashes. Parents checked for signs of infection, redness, swelling, warmth, or the occasional unexplained curse. Treatments involved soaking in boiled plant water, rubbing with oil, or whispering prayers passed down through generations. Tales of foot-blessing saints were shared at bedtime, part comfort, part distraction from the bleeding. In wealthier households, foot care took on a ceremonial elegance. Servants bathed their masters' feet in warm water infused with flower petals. After drying them with linen cloth, they rubbed in almond oil or balms made from goose fat and lavender. This ritual wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. Clean feet suggested status, control, and leisure, the luxury of resting while others labored. Shoemaking itself was both craft and art. Cobblers shaped soles, stitched uppers, and reinforced tiers. Using wooden lasts, foot-shaped molds, they aimed for consistency. Nails, glue, and binding cords held the pieces together. A skilled cobbler could make shoes that lasted multiple seasons. A master could create footwear fit for a wedding, a festival, or the procession of a particularly picky bishop. Shoes became status symbols. Among the nobility, pointed shoes were wildly fashionable and equally impractical. Some curled at the toe. Others extended so far forward they had to be tied to the leg to prevent tripping. These shoes weren't meant for walking. They were for being seen watching others walk. Religious attitudes toward feet were laced with paradox. On one hand, feet were humble, dusty, sweaty, and earthbound. On the other, they were sacred. Washing feet was an act of humility and devotion. In monasteries, monks performed foot washing regularly as both cleansing and spiritual discipline. Pilgrims had their feet washed at holy sites. The image of Christ washing his disciples' feet echoed through churches, sermons, and the occasional awkward banquet. Medieval literature rarely mentioned feet unless something had gone wrong. A knight might be praised for being fleet-footed, but his boots remained a mystery, unless they tore or bled. Commoners' feet made brief appearances in legal documents, often in the context of injuries involving livestock, market carts, or overly enthusiastic maypole celebrations. Travelers faced their own set of foot-related ordeals. Long-distance walking over rough, often unforgiving terrain took its toll. Pilgrims endured cracked heels, sprains, and bruised soles. To cope, they padded their shoes with wool, stitched on new soles, and took rest stops at communal way stations to soak their aching feet. Some wore sandals made of bark or rope. Others walked barefoot, either as an act of devotion or because they had no alternative. Foot deformities were common and rarely treated. Bunions, collapsed arches, and hammer toes were considered inevitable signs of age or misfortune. Folk remedies ranged from the curious to the absurd. Wrapping the foot in rabbit blood-soaked cloth, reciting healing chants under moonlight, or pressing a toad to the sole while serenading it were all practiced with various levels of belief and desperation. Effectiveness varied, though in fairness, so did expectations. The toad, of course, was rarely impressed. And yet, in spite of it all, medieval feet endured. They carried people to weddings and funerals, to market stalls and battlefield lines. They stomped in celebration, shuffled in sorrow, and marched into fate, protected only by what could be cobbled together from leather, wool, and sheer determination. No, the medieval foot was not beautiful. It wasn't sung about or painted with reverence, but it was respected, quietly, reluctantly, and often through the simple, almost sacred act of washing, drying, and stepping forward again. But if there's one facet of medieval life that would confound a modern time traveler above all others, it might just be the toilet situation, or more accurately, the chronic absence of anything resembling a modern one. Bodily functions didn't pause for the 1200s. They simply adapted, often in ways that were creative, unsettling, and deeply communal. Sanitation was more a loose suggestion than a regulated system, and privacy was regularly sacrificed for the sake of immediacy. The medieval version of a bathroom was the garderobe. In castles and fortified manors, this small stone room was built into the exterior wall, often cantilevered above a courtyard or moat. Inside sat a wooden bench with a hole cut into it. Waste dropped straight down a vertical shaft, sometimes into a cesspit, sometimes into open air, and occasionally, alarmingly, onto a lower level of the building if architectural foresight had taken the day off. In theory, the garderobe offered a modicum of privacy. In practice, it was a cold, drafty hole that let the wind howl upwards with malevolent force. Many were constructed high up to assist gravity, not necessarily safety, making nighttime visits a test of balance, aim, and spiritual resolve. The smell was permanent. Castle walls absorbed everything. People tried to combat this by hanging bunches of herbs like lavender, mint, or rosemary, or stuffing straw into the cracks. Occasionally, lime was tossed down the shaft in a noble effort to neutralize the stench. Whether this was effective or merely optimistic is still a matter of debate. For townsfolk or rural families, options were humbler. Most used chamber pots, simple ceramic or wooden bowls tucked under the bed or stashed in a dark corner. These were for nighttime use, bad weather, or moments when the trek to a communal latrine felt like too much of an adventure. In the morning, the contents were dumped, ideally into a cesspit, but more often out a window. This was often accompanied by the infamous cry "Garde à l'eau," French for "watch out for the water," which may or may not have been shouted with sincerity. Pedestrians who failed to heed the warning got a very unpleasant reminder of where they lived. Streets were narrow, drainage was poor, and footwear was tragically absorbent. People learned to walk close to buildings and wore long cloaks with hems doomed to disappointment. Public latrines did exist in larger towns, often placed near rivers. These ranged from open-air wooden platforms to semi-enclosed stalls, sometimes with separate sections for men and women. They were cleaned sporadically and used enthusiastically. Waste flowed directly into the river. Yes, the same rivers that also provided drinking water, giving birth to a circular ecosystem of increasingly regrettable decisions. Wiping materials varied wildly. The wealthy might use cloth, which was then washed and reused by someone else. The poor relied on whatever nature provided: moss, hay, straw, wool tufts, or smooth stones. In coastal regions, mussel shells were occasionally employed, though history wisely avoids discussing their comfort rating. Others used their left hand and water, a long-standing practice in some cultures, with very clear social consequences. To offer the left hand in greeting was a grievous insult for a reason. Toilet paper, as we know it, simply didn't exist in medieval Europe. Paper was expensive, parchment even more so. Books were sacred. The idea of using something printed, say, the Gospel of John, for personal hygiene would have been not just wasteful, but borderline heretical, regardless of its confusing Latin syntax. Toilets evolved slowly. Monasteries were pioneers in sanitation. Many had communal latrines built above channels of flowing water, redirected from nearby streams. These were some of the most advanced systems of their time. Monastic rules often included strict cleaning schedules, making their facilities cleaner than many noble estates. In towns, cesspits were commonly dug behind homes. These could be opened and covered as needed. When full, they were emptied by professionals known as gong farmers. Yes, that was a real job title. And surprisingly, it paid well, because nobody else wanted to do it. Gong farmers worked under cover of night, shoveling waste into barrels and hauling it beyond city limits. They were required to live apart from the general population, often near rivers or desolate plots of land, because their smell lingered with astonishing loyalty. Despite their low status, gong farmers were vital. Without them, streets backed up, homes flooded, and disease spread faster than gossip at a wedding feast. They were the unsung heroes of medieval hygiene, silently bearing society's filth while the rest of the town looked the other way. And diseases thrived in that silence. Dysentery, cholera, parasitic infections, these were constant threats. Flies buzzed freely, rats were ubiquitous, and the idea of a sterile food preparation surface was pure fantasy. Kitchens and latrines were dangerously close, sometimes even overlapping in smaller homes. People fought back the only ways they could, with herbs, with boiling water, and with prayer. Water was often avoided entirely for drinking. Beer and wine became the beverages of choice, not for indulgence, but for survival. Fermentation killed things the rivers couldn't. Toileting was often communal. In monasteries and public latrines, multiple holes were arranged side by side with little to no separation. Conversations happened. Debates sparked. Silence was rare. One entered with dignity and left with stories, sometimes too colorful for the dinner table. Children learned early. Toddlers had their own miniature chamber pots. Older children were taught to dispose of waste properly, or at the very least, not in the laundry basin. Accidents happened. Discipline followed. So did rats. Rats were fond of medieval toilets. They appreciated the warmth, the food scraps, and the darkness. There are historical accounts of unfortunate incidents involving exposed anatomy and deeply traumatized families. Travel complicated things even further. Pilgrims used bushes, streams, or designated spots just outside town walls. Some carried portable stools with holes cut into them, an early form of the travel potty. Soldiers dug trenches. Nobles brought collapsible chamber pots. Clever merchants carried aromatic herbs, hoping to mask the experience entirely. The smell, which also served to ward off conversation. 1 hour, 29 minutes, and 38 seconds. Disposal of waste was everyone's problem. Some cities had laws about when waste could be dumped. Enforcement was inconsistent. Penalties ranged from fines to public shaming. More often, people simply lived with the smells and hoped for a good wind. In winter, frozen waste piled up in alleys. In spring, it thawed. Nothing in medieval Europe smelled quite like spring. There was humor too. Medieval jokes often referenced bodily functions. Plays featured fart gags. Poems hinted at unfortunate noises. From the back row of the pew, one manuscript contains a recipe for a potion to silence the wind. 1 hour, 30 minutes, and 19 seconds. Involving boiled leeks and very specific prayer timing. No one knows if it worked, but the attempt speaks volumes. In the end, toileting in the 1200s was neither refined nor comfortable. It was pragmatic, improvisational, and remarkably effective. Given the tools, people did what they could. They built high towers to drop waste far away. They dug pits and hired men with strong backs and no sense of smell. They burned herbs, said prayers, and avoided looking down too often. Because in the medieval world, cleanliness began with creativity and sometimes a strong stomach. If the medieval toilet, 1 hour, 31 minutes, and 1 second, was a crisis of architecture, medieval medicine was a crisis of confidence. Hygiene in the context of healthcare was not a given. It was at best an aspiration. Medical treatment in the 1200s hovered somewhere between hopeful witchcraft and experimental carpentry. Instruments were sharp, explanations vague, and the chance of infection almost guaranteed. Let us begin with the tools. Scalpels, forceps, lancets, and needles were used repeatedly and rarely cleaned. Between patients, when they were cleaned, it was usually with wine vinegar, or if the practitioner was feeling cautious, boiling water. Boiling was a serious commitment. 1 hour, 31 minutes, and 47 seconds. It meant starting a fire, fetching a pot, heating it to the point of bubbling menace, and then maybe dunking the bloodstained blade inside for a moment before drying it on a sleeve. Surgeons wore no gloves. There were no surgical gowns. They worked in tunics, smeared with history. Their hands were rinsed only if visibly crusted blood was removed with rags. Snow or a corner of the tablecloth. Surgical surfaces, if they existed, were wooden planks or kitchen tables, scrubbed only if the last patient had been especially memorable. Wounds were packed with moss. 1 hour, 32 minutes, and 27 seconds. Herbs or lint. Moss was favored for its absorbency and availability. Honey, when accessible, was used to seal wounds and discourage infection. It worked better than many alternatives, though no one knew why. Wounds that festered were poulticed with garlic, onion, or warm bread mashed with beer. If it still smelled wrong after that, it was time for prayer. Leeches were standard fare. Physicians kept them in jars ready to apply at the slightest mention of excess blood. Leeches did not care about the reason. They just latched on and did their work. They were placed behind ears, on the arms, or on any spot deemed congested. They were valued companions. 1 hour, 33 minutes, and 14 seconds. Of any serious medical toolkit, seconded only to knives and unchecked enthusiasm. Bloodletting charts existed. They detailed which veins to open for which ailments: a headache, right arm fever, left ankle melancholy, behind the knee. Just in case, these charts were based on centuries of theory, artistic diagrams, and a deep faith in human fluids being the source of most problems. Cupping was also used. Horns or cups were heated and pressed to the skin, creating suction that raised blood toward the surface. This was believed to balance humors. 1 hour, 33 minutes, and 56 seconds. Draw out impurities and prevent illness. What it usually did was leave circular bruises and a lingering suspicion of the healer's qualifications. Barber surgeons handled much of the practical medicine. They shaved beards, pulled teeth, drained abscesses, and lanced boils all in one appointment. If requested, their tools clattered inside leather rolls, stained and slightly mismatched. They worked in market-side rooms, and sometimes bath houses. A good one was respected, a bad one left behind limp patients, and dented confidence hospitals, such as they were. 1 hour 34 minutes and 36 seconds. Prioritized shelter over surgery. These were often monastic institutions. Patients lay in rows on straw mattresses. Windows where few ventilation was a rumor. Linens were changed when they could no longer be ignored. Nurses were nuns or monks who believed service to the sick purified the soul. They washed patients with herbal water, applied ointments, and read prayers over the dying. Cleanliness in hospitals was aspirational. Pests were common. Rats ran freely. Fleas were practically starved. Yet there was structure. Monks kept herb gardens, dried lavender to hang above beds. 1 hour 35 minutes and 17 seconds. And burned sage to purify the air. Sickness was a physical state, but it was also seen as a spiritual test. Purity of the soul mattered more than sterility of the sheets. In homes, care was domestic. A mother might grind comfrey root for a broken bone. A grandmother might rub nettle oil into a twisted ankle. Healing was a family affair. Recipes were passed down, often whispered, rarely written. A good healer knew how to mix feverfew, when to scald milk, and which prayers to say before pouring vinegar onto an open wound. 1 hour 35 minutes and 56 seconds. Not all ailments were treated equally. Leprosy was feared and misunderstood. Lepers were exiled to the outskirts, housed in colonies where they lived with minimal care and maximum stigma. They wore bells to signal their approach. Their wounds were tended with basic salves, and their hygiene consisted of river water and resignation. Mental illness was even more poorly treated. The afflicted were considered possessed, cursed, or morally flawed. Treatments included confinement, isolation, cold baths, and exorcisms. Hygiene for these individuals, 1 hour 36 minutes and 36 seconds, was rarely prioritized. They were sometimes chained, sometimes beaten, occasionally pitted, and frequently ignored. Childbirth was dangerous. Midwives were central figures, blending folk knowledge with practical experience. They washed their hands when possible with wine or vinegar. Cord cutting was done with knives, flint, or teeth. The mother was bathed only if time allowed. Infants were rubbed with salt, washed in herbal water, and wrapped tightly if both survived the birth. It was celebrated with gratitude and a strong drink. 1 hour 37 minutes and 14 seconds. Medical texts were scarce, handwritten in Latin and illustrated with optimism. Remedies included instructions for mixing herbs with lard, boiling frog skin, or applying ashes of burnt shoes. Not all recipes were dangerous. Some were surprisingly effective, but the lack of standardization meant results depended heavily on luck, weather, and interpretation of the stars. Academic medicine was growing. Universities in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford offered lectures on galenic theory. Students studied human anatomy using animals, guessed at internal functions, and debated. 1 hour 37 minutes and 53 seconds. The influence of planetary movements on fevers. They believed in balance. Hot and cold, wet and dry bile and blood. Hygiene played a part, but moderation was more important. A clean patient might still suffer if the moon was in the wrong phase. Traveling healers filled gaps. They wandered from village to village, selling potions, offering treatments, and telling stories. Some were honest, others were charlatans. They sold snake oil without snakes, miracle tonics with questionable herbs, and guaranteed cures that worked precisely. Never still, they were welcomed. 1 hour 38 minutes and 33 seconds. Part doctor, part entertainer, part hope. Plague had not yet devastated Europe, but smaller outbreaks of illness prepared the ground. Towns developed rudimentary quarantine practices. Homes with illness might be marked. Whole streets were avoided. Healers burned sulfur in sick rooms, washed walls with vinegar, and wore herbal amulets. The link between cleanliness and health was forming, one outbreak at a time. Some forward thinkers emphasized bathing. A few doctors argued that washing the body reduced odors, which might reduce disease. 1 hour 39 minutes and 12 seconds. Others insisted baths opened the pores and invited danger. The result was confusion. People bathed, but nervously. They cleaned wounds, but only when they smelled offensive. They boiled water, but mostly for broth. Despite it all, there was care, there was effort. People tried. They wiped blood with cloths that were rinsed in cold streams. They gathered herbs from wild hills. They saved bandages, rewound them, and said prayers as they tightened. The human body remained a mystery, and hygiene was far from an exact science, but it was something closer to devotion. It was a matter of attention, repetition, and quiet tenderness. To fall ill was common. To be treated was a flicker of hope. To survive was nothing short of a miracle. In the 1200s, cleanliness and religion weren't necessarily about soap. They were about symbolism. Washing didn't always mean removing grime. It often meant removing sin. A clean face could signify humility. Clean hands were a sign of readiness. Scrubbed feet weren't being sanitized, they were being sanctified. Monasteries embodied this paradox. Monks bathed infrequently, perhaps only a few times a year, in strict adherence to monastic calendars. Yet, certain parts of their bodies were washed routinely. Hands and faces were cleansed multiple times a day, after waking, before meals, before prayer, and on holy days. These rituals weren't done for comfort or cleanliness. They were acts of discipline, performed in silence, using shared basins and cold water. The washings were communal but reverent. The water was seldom refreshed. Its symbolic purpose outweighed its clarity. The emphasis was not on eliminating germs, unknown at the time, but on banishing disorder from the soul. Ritual cleanliness reinforced a sacred structure. Clean hands indicated spiritual preparedness. Dirty ones, like a distracted mind, hinted at moral neglect. Foot washing was more formalized, occurring on specific days, most notably Maundy Thursday. On that day, monks knelt before one another and washed feet in remembrance of Christ's act of humility. The water was frigid. The cloths were coarse. The room hushed. Feet that were cracked, fungal, or calloused from decades of pacing stone cloisters were handled with solemn grace. Pilgrims practiced similar symbolic washings. After weeks or months trekking through dust and hardship, they would rinse their faces and hands at shrines, springs, or sacred fountains. The water might be stale, shared, or murky, but the act of touching it marked a spiritual transformation. A splash across the brow or a brief rinse of the palms was less about hygiene and more about arrival. Monastic architecture reflected these rituals. Communal wash basins called lavatoria lined cloister walks, stone troughs fed by flowing water from aqueducts or cisterns. Monks stood side by side, washing quietly as the soft sound of water echoed through the stone passageways. The stream symbolized divine grace, constant, shared, and flowing without end. Garments, too, carried spiritual significance. Priests wore white albs and embroidered chasubles, each expected to be spotless during Mass. These vestments were handled with reverence, stored in linen-lined chests and laundered as if preparing them for sacred duty. A priest with a visible stain on his robes might not be directly reprimanded, but whispers would follow. Clean robes reflected spiritual attentiveness. Wrinkled hems suggested distraction. Despite this, full-body bathing was discouraged. The Church cautioned against frequent immersion, warning that it weakened the flesh, incited temptation, or stirred pride. Cleanliness could become indulgence. Bathing too often hinted at vanity. Some saints were revered specifically for their refusal to bathe. St. Thomas of Canterbury was said to have worn his robes so long they fused with his skin. This wasn't viewed as slovenliness. It was celebrated as spiritual detachment. Hermits and ascetics took it even further. Living in huts, caves, or forest shelters, they rejected washing entirely. To them, the body was a temporary vessel. Dirt served as a reminder that nothing earthly was permanent. Soap, warmth, and comfort were distractions. The more they stank, the more they believed they were defeating vanity. Their filth was their testimony. And yet, paradoxically, the Church did wash the dead. Before burial, the body was gently bathed, cleansed with holy water, wine, or consecrated oils. Limbs were sponged, faces wiped, mouths closed, hair was brushed. These rituals were both practical, to slow decay, and sacred, to ready the soul for divine judgment. It was the final purification, the one that mattered most. In cases where the deceased was believed to be saintly, the cloth used to wash the body might be kept as a relic, preserved as if holiness could be absorbed through touch. Holy water held immense symbolic power. It was sprinkled on altars, homes, people, livestock. It cleansed and protected. Pilgrims carried small vials of it, filled at shrines and tied to belts or tucked in satchels. Its scent, dusty, metallic, tinged with rosemary, lingered like a whisper of the sacred. Newborns, soldiers, and travelers were all touched by it before setting out into the unknown. Before major feast days, public churches underwent grand cleanings. Candlesticks were polished, altars wiped, floors swept, Banners dusted and rehung. Parishioners joined in. The scrubbing became penance. To scour a church floor on your hands and knees was to humble yourself before God. A blister from wiping pews could stand in for confession. But there was a line. Suspicion surrounded anyone who seemed too clean. A man who bathed too often might be seen as vain. A woman who wore fragrant oils might be accused of seduction or spiritual laxity. Scent was closely scrutinized. If it came from incense, it signaled sanctity. If it came from perfume, it suggested impropriety. Social class colored these judgments. A nobleman who smelled of rose water was admired. A servant who did the same could be reprimanded. The double standard extended beyond fragrance. A monk who washed his hands daily but wore the same robe was praised for his restraint. A woman who swept her home but styled her hair too meticulously might be chided for caring too much about worldly things. Cleanliness became metaphor. Sermons brimmed with phrases about washing away sin, rinsing lies from the mouth, or scouring the soul with prayer. These weren't just poetic flourishes, they influenced behavior. People scrubbed harder before attending church. They donned freshly aired clothing. They blessed their animals with holy water on feast days. They wiped dirt from their children's faces with sleeves worn thin from repetition. And then there was baptism, the ultimate sacred bath. Whether given to infants or converts, it marked a transformation. Water met skin, and in that moment, the body was not just washed, it was reborn. It was the skin being touched, but the soul that was intended to be cleansed. Some churches constructed elaborate baptismal fonts, stone basins that rose to the waist, often filled with cold water. Others used simpler bowls. The method varied, but the purpose remained constant: entrance into grace through water. In certain pilgrimage towns, basic wooden bathhouses were set up near the gates of sacred sites. These spaces offered weary travelers a chance to rinse away the road's dust and grime before approaching relics. Soap was optional. Modesty was fluid, but intention mattered most. Washing became part of the devotion. One didn't kneel before a saint while still wearing layers of dried mud and mystery puddles. Art reinforced this idea. Paintings and stained glass depicted angels washing saints' feet, Mary wiping the face of the infant Christ, and Jesus himself kneeling to wash Peter's feet. In these images, water shimmered. It caught the light like mercy itself. It wasn't about scrubbing away filth, it was about the act of care. Cleanliness wouldn't save a soul, but it might prepare one for salvation. It offered structure in a chaotic world, a tangible gesture when life was formless. It gave the faithful something to do, hands to rinse, cloths to fold, feet to cleanse, while they waited for grace to descend. In an age of uncertainty, washing even a single thing became a small but potent act of hope. The medieval market, by contrast, was chaos distilled into commerce. A swirling hive of trade, gossip, livestock, and MUD. Depending on the season, it delivered a pungent bouquet of everything recently run, rotted, or butchered. Hygiene wasn't absent, it just followed a different logic. It was a negotiation between practicality, resource availability, and a remarkable ability to ignore smells that would drop a modern visitor on the spot. Markets ran daily or weekly, depending on the town, sprawling across public squares and overflowing into alleys. Merchants hawked vegetables beside fishmongers, while blacksmiths pounded iron within earshot of women selling rushes or herbs. Waste disposal was communal in the vaguest sense. Everyone contributed to avoiding it. Hygiene measures were mostly reactive. If the stench became unbearable, someone might throw down straw. If flies gathered in riotous clouds, a vendor might mutter, "Light some dried rosemary," and wave it around like a scented exorcism. Fishmongers rinsed their stalls with water hauled from rivers that also served as public sewers. The rinse washed away scales, guts, and stray eyeballs, only to mingle with manure and settle into the street soup that coated town centers. If conscientious, the merchant might sweep the muck into a ditch. If not, it remained, slowly fermenting beneath passing feet. Summer heat enhanced the experience. Winter merely paused it. Frozen filth waited patiently for thaw. Butchers followed a similar ethos. Blood, bones, and parts best left undescribed were byproducts of their trade. Cutting blocks, often wooden, weren't so much cleaned as scraped, flipped, and eventually discarded in flames. Blood soaked into tables, floors, and aprons. Gloves weren't used. Aprons rarely changed. You could recognize a butcher by scent alone. By midday, flies had declared jurisdiction. Bakers operated in a slightly more appealing corner of the market. The air was warmer, aromatic, and less nauseating. Bread's scent became a kind of olfactory mercy. Bakers dealt with flour, yeast, coals, and sticky dough that clung like guilt. Their ovens were self-cleaned by fire. Their tools wiped on aprons, not washed. Rats and flour beetles were familiar co-workers, tolerated but not advertised. Street vendors peddling hot meat pies or stews worked over open charcoal braziers. The heat helped kill both bacteria and doubt. Utensils were scarce. Bowls were wooden or made from cheap clay. Dishwashing meant rinsing repeatedly in a single barrel until the water became opaque, then maybe stirring it to buy a few more hours of illusion. Ale houses were equally pragmatic. Drinking vessels were wiped with ancient cloths that could recount their own history. Fortunately, the ale itself was safer than the water, fermentation being the era's most consistent hygiene hack. Patrons shared mugs, benches, and coughs. Salt was pinched with fingers that had touched too many things. Still, people gathered, drank, laughed, and somehow lived to do it again the next day. Textile workers had their own struggles. Fullers, weavers, and dyers operated on the outskirts, for reasons both practical and nasal. Fulling involved stomping wool in vats filled with water and urine. Ammonia softened the fibers. The stench softened optimism. The process was usually done barefoot, and the rinsed cloth was laid out in open fields, where birds offered unwanted feedback from above. Dyers boiled fabrics in large vats of plant pigments, mordants, and questionable water. The resulting hues were rich and unpredictable. Gloves were rare, so hands bore the evidence. The color-stained fingers of a dyer could reveal the season's fashion trends. Cleaning the dye vats wasn't a priority. Producing the next batch was. Some dyers took pride in their rainbow-colored scars. Trades like blacksmithing, coopering, and carpentry didn't concern themselves with cleanliness unless it interfered with the work. Soot, sawdust, and grease were constants. Workbenches were dark with stains. Tools were wiped, not washed. Injuries, burns, cuts, splinters were treated with spit, rags, or if lucky, a smear of honey. Infections were occupational hazards. A smith with all 10 fingers was a marvel. One with 9 was respected. 8 meant either bad luck or unusually quick reflexes. Barbers were another hybrid profession. Their shops doubled as surgical suites. They cut hair, trimmed beards, pulled teeth, and lanced boils. Their tools hung on walls or rested on stained tables. Cleaning them involved a brisk rinse and a whispered prayer. Hygiene may not have been consistent, but it was earnest. The medieval marketplace was built on that blend of hope, hard work, and a willingness to scrub only when absolutely necessary. In the medieval world, a single blade could serve dual purposes. It might shave a chin in the morning and draw blood from an arm by dusk. The barber's chair was a simple wooden frame, the floor strewn with straw, often damp and matted. The air carried an antiseptic tang, not from cleanliness, but from a scent so potent it drove away microbes and perhaps a few wary customers. This was hygiene in practice, practical, raw, and unapologetic. Laundry workers, often women, toiled in grueling conditions, their hands perpetually submerged in filth. Clothes were soaked, beaten, scrubbed, and boiled in water hauled by hand from rivers or wells. Ash was mixed in to soften the water, and soap, when available, was coarse, homemade, and unforgiving. These laundresses knelt by riverbanks, leaning over smooth stones, their knuckles cracking, their backs aching in protest. Their hands, wrinkled as prunes, carried the faint scent of smoke, lime, and sodden wool. If fortune favored them, the river's current carried the grime downstream. If not, they worked in the murky runoff of someone else's hopeful labor. In towns, street cleaners, often criminals sentenced to public labor or the desperately poor, earned meager coins for their unsavory work. Armed with brooms, rakes, and shovels, they scraped animal droppings from cobblestones, cleared refuse from gutters, and hauled away market waste. Their clothes reeked of their trade, and no one offered thanks. Yet their absence was keenly felt. A missing cleaner meant a day of cautious steps and a week of regret as the streets grew fouler. Privy maintenance, vital yet revolting, fell to the gong farmers, unsung heroes of the night. These workers emptied cesspits beneath homes and public latrines, carting the waste to designated pits or fields outside town. The pay was good, but only because few could stomach the task. Gong farmers were socially shunned, yet economically admired, utterly indispensable. At a tavern, you gave them space, perhaps a quiet nod, and sometimes an ale as silent gratitude for their grim service. Amid this chaos, women selling herbs, flowers, or perfumes brought fleeting relief to the senses. Their stalls offered bundles of rosemary, lavender, or mint, some sprinkled with rosewater, others adorned with scented pouches to wear around the neck. These were said to fend off foul air and misfortune, a temporary shield against the stench of nearby butchers and fishmongers. For a few coins, you could carry the fragrance of hope rather than the odor of decay. Despite the disorder, a peculiar rhythm held the medieval marketplace together. People built resilience, not just to disease, but to disgust itself. They learned where to step, when to hold their breath, and which stalls changed their straw most often. The aroma of fresh bread, roasted meat, or ripening apples offered brief reprieves amid gusts of unwashed humanity. A well-placed pie cart could lift spirits, if only for a moment. Sanitation laws existed in some cities, mandating that merchants clean their stalls, dispose of waste properly, and cover meat to keep flies at bay. Enforcement, however, was inconsistent, often swayed by bribes of food or produce. A hot roll could erase the need for paperwork. A slab of meat might make an inspector look the other way. Hygiene and commerce balanced precariously, driven more by hunger than by principle. Yet people endured. They ate, traded, laughed, and haggled over turnips, wiping their hands on tunics and savoring pickled eels with relish. Children darted through alleys, dogs pilfered bones from butchers, and pigeons added their own commentary from above. The market thrived, chaotic and vibrantly alive. Hygiene in the medieval workspace wasn't about sterilization, it was about rhythm. Work, wash, work again. Tools were rinsed when time allowed, and cleaning was pragmatic. Scrub what must be scrubbed, leave the rest to the rain. Occasionally, a bucket of water was tossed into the street, and that was progress enough. Grooming, however, was more than hygiene. It was a performance of self-respect, survival, and practiced denial. While modern grooming evokes images of scented lotions and well-lit mirrors, medieval grooming was a battle against the elements, often done with one eye on the weather and one foot dodging unmentionable puddles. Hair, for both men and women, was a focal point, not just for style but as a battleground against lice, nits, and the occasional poetic metaphor. Combs, carried on belts or tucked into satchels, were crafted from bone, wood, or horn. Double-sided, with fine teeth for lice and wider ones for detangling. They were wielded publicly and without shame. During meals, conversations, or even sermons, if the priest was distracted by his own scalp. Lice were so common that their absence might raise eyebrows. Remedies ranged from vinegar to garlic paste, with some daring souls applying ashes mixed with bare fat, combing furiously until the lice either perished or sought less hostile territory. Herbs like wormwood or rue were woven into braids or sewn into head coverings, their strong scent perhaps convincing pests to relocate. Children, the most infested and least bothered, were often deloused in the street with a comb and a scowl. Beards told their own stories, varying by region and era. Monks and clergy shaved as a sign of humility, while nobles sculpted their beards to flaunt status. Peasants made do, trimming with knives or singeing scraggly ends with hot irons. Razors were non-existent. Blades were sharp enough to intimidate whiskers into submission. Beard oils, often just herb-scented animal fat, were applied, though some preferred the natural aroma of salted mutton. Beard combs, smaller versions of hair combs, were used in communal trimming sessions where one man steadied the head, another cut, and a third offered unsolicited advice. Eyebrows and eyelashes were largely left alone, though noble women might pluck their brows thin with bronze or iron tweezers, which doubled as splinter removers. Eyelashes were never painted, but soot or charcoal might be smudged around the eyes, part beautification, part insect repellent, part mystery. Nails were kept short, trimmed with knives, or worn down by labor. Hands, constantly in contact with soil, ash, and worse, were scrubbed with sand, soaproot, salt, or vinegar, then wiped on aprons with enthusiastic disregard. Teeth were cleaned with cloths rubbed with salt or chewed clean with aromatic twigs. Mouth rinses of wine, vinegar, or herbal infusions masked bad breath, supplemented by chewing parsley, mint, or silence. Lip balm, made from animal fat flavored with berry juice or resin, was applied with fingers that had likely just cleaned something else. Perfume, when used, was subtle: rose water for the wealthy, lavender water for others, or herbal sachets for commoners. In courts, a pleasant scent was a social weapon. In the fields, it might raise suspicions unless one was dodging a marriage proposal. Ears were cleaned with linen twists or carved picks of bone, ivory, or wood. A clean ear was prized, though rarely inspected, and earaches were treated with warm oil and wool plugs. Body hair was managed as needed. Armpit or leg hair might be plucked or scraped to deter lice, but waxes and lasers were centuries away. Hair removal was practical, not aesthetic, and in some communities, body hair sparked public debate if it attracted fleas to shared meals. Scents carried weight. A whiff of herbs might suggest piety or recent healing. The reek of fish implied fresh employment. Smelling of nothing was either suspiciously fortunate or the result of a recent dunk in a stream. In some towns, rumors swirled that certain people's breath could curdle milk or sour beer, turning smell into myth. Clothing aided grooming. Linen shifts absorbed sweat, wool cloaks repelled dirt, and head coverings concealed lice outbreaks. Shoes, stuffed with straw for insulation, helped control odor, while gloves shielded hands from grime and scandal. Accessories like pins and combs doubled as status symbols. Grooming was a public signal. A well-combed head hinted at preparation for a meeting, clean nails suggested a marriage negotiation, and a perfumed kerchief carried unspoken messages. Dirty hands might reflect hard work, or a failure to wash after something unsavory. Clean shoes implied a short walk or an important guest. Bathing was rare, but grooming was relentless. People dusted clothes with powdered herbs, beat dirt from tunics, and polished shoes with rough cloth and spit. They adjusted belts, picked lint from sleeves, and straightened collars before meals. A wooden mirror, faintly reflective, reassured them they still existed. Children were groomed roughly, their faces wiped, hair combed, and hands inspected for grime. A clean child was proof of responsible parenting, or at least a recent scolding. Among the wealthy, grooming was theatrical. Servants brushed hair, trimmed nails, and washed feet while their masters discussed politics or poultry. For the poor, it was quick: a splash of water, a comb through the hair, and a wipe of the hands. Tools, advice, and fleas were shared among neighbors, who helped braid hair, delouse children, or trim wayward mustaches. Despite limited access to baths, medieval people cared deeply about appearance. Grooming wasn't vanity. It was survival, a declaration of effort in a world where disease lingered and first impressions mattered. By the late 1200s, public health was emerging as a concern, though not yet a profession. Without microscopes or germ theory, people relied on noses, instincts, and memories of past plagues. They knew, without fully understanding why, that filth, waste, and foul air brought danger. Hygiene was an act of fear, hope, and defiance against the unknown. Before the Black Death, smaller outbreaks, dysentery, fever, ergot poisoning, ravaged communities. When illness struck, people turned to smoke, prayer, herbs, and distancing, a crude precursor to quarantine. Public baths closed during outbreaks, latrines were cleaned more diligently, and aromatic herbs were burned indoors. Cities like London, Paris, and Florence introduced basic ordinances, dictating where waste could be dumped and when markets had to be cleaned. Enforcement was spotty, but the laws existed. A fishmonger might be fined for leaving guts in the street, a tanner ordered to move their vats outside city walls. These were the first steps toward official hygiene, however symbolic. Midwives, barbers, and bath attendants passed down knowledge through stories and habits, observing that foul smells often preceded sickness and crowded rooms bred coughs. Waste was a growing issue as towns grew denser. Cesspits overflowed, rats proliferated, and rain turned streets into filthy rivers. People walked with eyes down, scraping shoes on stones and teaching children to play uphill from drains. Cleanliness became a moral signal. A tidy stall suggested an honest merchant. A brushed cloak implied respectability. Pigs were banned from some streets. Butchers ordered to clean up, and wells protected to preserve water quality. Beer and wine, safer than water due to brewing, were staples for children and adults alike. In churches, cleanliness carried spiritual weight. A dirty church might invite divine judgment, so floors were swept, pews wiped, and holy water refreshed. Hygiene, in all its forms, was a fragile defense against chaos, a blend of observation, superstition, and stubborn hope. In the medieval world, effort was everything. Clean fingernails might not stop a plague, but they could earn respect. A combed beard might not secure a job, but it could spark a conversation. A wiped nose, a brushed tunic, a half-washed face. These were not just signs of decency, but declarations of resilience, and sometimes that was enough. In the medieval church, altar cloths were meticulously washed, aired in the open, and inspected for vermin. Cleanliness was more than practicality, it was a sacred act. A pure space mirrored pure worship, and a spotless church stood as both symbol and shield against unseen threats. The plague had not yet unleashed its full fury, but whispers of distant devastations, great dyings in far-off lands, had already reached fearful ears. A single cough in a crowded room could empty it in moments. Families buried their dead swiftly, burning clothes and sealing rooms, blurring the line between caution and panic. Hygiene grew sharper, more desperate. People bathed with vinegar, draped themselves in perfumed fabrics, and fasted, praying for divine protection. Fear honed their habits into rituals of survival. Some towns took tentative steps toward public health, appointing wardens to oversee cleanliness. These figures patrolled streets, peered into homes, ordered sweepings, and sometimes shuttered bathhouses or bakeries deemed too risky. They were met with resentment, bribes, or grudging obedience, depending on the season and the town's mood. Lacking modern tools or knowledge, they carried wooden staffs, heavy lists of duties, and often the faint scent of cloves to mask the stench of their rounds. Their presence, however limited, marked the stirring of a new idea, that health could be a shared responsibility, a communal effort against invisible foes. In rural villages, cleanliness was tethered to the rhythms of nature. Villagers washed in clear streams, hung laundry to dry in sunlit fields, and swept dirt floors with stiff brooms. Manure was managed with pitchforks and care, piled strategically to avoid contamination. Herbs were hung in doorways, burned in corners, or tucked into shoes to ward off foulness. Animals were kept outside, or sometimes inside, depending on the weather and the household size. These homes were not pristine, but they were ordered, functional. The air might carry the scent of smoke and damp straw, but this was not neglect. It was life, shaped by necessity and habit. Folk remedies flourished as defenses against unseen illnesses. Some wore pouches of toad bones around their necks, believing they held protective power. Others carried written charms, bathed in dew on midsummer mornings, or placed garlic on windowsills to repel sickness. Illness was seen as both physical and spiritual, and so cleanliness straddled both realms. A body could be cleansed with water, a home purified with ritual, a town sanctified by procession. Healers prescribed spiritual cleansing alongside physical remedies. A sick person might be bathed and confessed in the same breath. A fast might be ordered, not for the stomach but for the soul. Holy water and herbal tea, poultices and penance, were administered together. When all else failed, the priest and the barber collaborated. One tended the soul, the other the body. Cultural attitudes toward cleanliness grew rigid. Laziness was equated with filth, and a family that neglected to sweep their stoop might be judged as neglectful of their faith. Clean clothes, even if patched and worn, signaled diligence and care. Small gestures carried weight. Shaking straw from shoes before entering a church, wiping soot from a face before a meal, brushing crumbs from a tunic before confession. These acts were declarations of effort, visible proofs of virtue in a world where appearances mattered. Guilds began to impose their own rules on hygiene. laying the groundwork for later health codes. Tanners were banished to the outskirts of towns, their vats too foul for city air. Butchers were assigned specific dumping grounds for offal. Barbers were expected to keep their tools clean, though clean was a loose term, often meaning free of visible blood. Merchants selling food had to cover their wares to deter flies. Bakers scraped ash from ovens, and brewers scoured barrels to ensure their ale remained untainted. These were not yet formal regulations, but they were precursors, signs of a society beginning to recognize that order and cleanliness were intertwined. People tried, in countless small ways, to impose structure on chaos. They lit herbs in sick rooms to purify the air, avoided meat during fast days, and aired bedding in the winter sun. They scraped waste from doorsteps, filled barrels with rainwater, and sewed herbal sachets into cloaks. Hands were rinsed in basins before meals, not always, not by everyone, but often enough to matter. Cleanliness could not cure disease or halt plagues, but it offered comfort, a fragile sense of control in a world where health hung by a thread. A mother brushing her child's hair before market, a merchant wiping his stall with a damp cloth, a baker sweeping ash from the oven floor. These were not grand gestures, but they were daily, deliberate. In their repetition, a quiet order emerged. In the 1200s, health was fragile, and dirt was ever present, but discipline was stronger. People could not see the enemy, but they could sweep, scrub, sprinkle, and soak. They could try, and sometimes, trying was the only medicine they had. The fire has long since burned low. The markets have emptied, their clamor faded into silence. The footsteps that once trudged through muddy streets are now mere echoes, faint traces on parchment, quiet gestures in candlelight. The 1200s lie behind you, a world stitched together by repetition and resolve. Picture the final moments of a day in that time. A woman bends over a wash basin in her home's dim corner, the water murky, her fingers stiff from the day's labor. She hums softly, brushing dust from her child's cheeks, smoothing his hair with hands that have wrung linen and carried rushes from the market. There is no soap left, but the act itself matters. Across the town, a baker wipes flour from a bench with the corner of his apron, not because anyone will notice, but because tomorrow will dawn and the bench must be ready. The smells have quieted now, the smoke has settled, the herbs in the rafters have dried to brittle husks. The vinegar water that once scrubbed a wound or polished a pew has long been poured away. Dirt lingers beneath fingernails, lice hide in braids, and the faint scent of sheep clings to woolen cloaks. But the worst has been managed. The basin is emptied, the straw shaken, the candle trimmed. They tried. That is what lingers in the stillness. Not perfection, but effort. Not glamour, but habit. In the face of illness, in the absence of certainty, they combed, scrubbed, swept, and stirred. They did not always know why, they only knew they must. Now, as your own room grows quiet and your thoughts soften, let those rhythms carry you. Let them settle behind your eyes, gentle and slow, the comb gliding through hair, the cloth brushing a cheek, the hush of water being poured. Sleep well.